All right, so everybody, what we're going to do today is we are going to be talking about data retention. So data retention falls under records management, and Dharma Diambok does provide guidelines on this topic as well. So Howard's going to come in after me to provide you with the view from Dharma, from the Dharma Diambok. What I'm going to do today is give you a heads up about what it is that POPI says you should be doing about data protection, about records management, and specifically retention. Got it right? Okay. So can you see my slide back now?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Excellent. Always better. All right, so I'm just going to quickly run through with you what it is that POPI says about the protection of personal information, what the law says about retaining records. I'm not going to touch on PIA today because I think it's too much. PIA is the promotion of access to information. It's the sister regulation for POPI, and it's also managed by the information regulator. But we're going to stick to POPI today, right? So it's been the focus for these talks. So first of all, just a little bit about me. I've, for my sins, had many years experience with various IT projects, lots of IT governance projects, ISO audits and certifications. And I am coming today to talk about privacy specifically and around POPI, which I've been dealing with POPI, literally since 2017 full time. But I'm not a lawyer. Anything I say to you today is entirely me as a consultant, somebody who's worked with other organizations to build their compliance frameworks. But I'm not a lawyer. Clearway Consulting is not a legal practice. And anything I say today potentially doesn't apply to you at all. And obviously, you must always get legal advice if you're ever in doubt. Right, so what do we do at Clearwood? Essentially, we help you to manage information risk. We look at privacy compliance, we look at information management, and we also run awareness training programs. And in fact, we develop awareness training programs as internal communication programs. So they shouldn't be standalone once-off activities. They should be part of your ongoing communication strategy. Right, so first of all, where are we? Within POPI, POPI lists first of all, we're ready to go. Is everybody happy to go? Any questions coming up in the chat? Howard, will you stop me if there's questions? Okay.
Sure.
So first of all, POPI provides us with 8 conditions for lawful processing. What this means is that there are things, when it comes to processing information, you need to be doing it in a way that is lawful. All right, so you need to be complying with POPI. And when you do your processing, you need to look at it and ask yourself, like, have we established accountability for this information, for this data? Have we implemented security controls? And records retention comes in under purpose specification, right? So what purpose specification is about is POPI says that when you collect information, you must do it with a purpose. You mustn't just collect information for maybe because one day we might need it. So under purpose specification, what it says is that you've got to have a clear purpose. You've got to have a clear justification for processing the information. In other words, it must be some sort of legal requirement or consent from the data subject or a contract or something that says that you as an organization ought to be processing this information. But then it also says you've got to stop processing the information, right? Once that purpose has ended, you need to stop processing. In other words, you need to get rid of the data. So this is the actual section. It's section 14. And paraphrasing, essentially, the blanket rule is you may not retain records any longer than is necessary for achieving the purpose, right? So the blanket rule is you've got to, if you've got no good reason to have it, you should get rid of it. Then it gives a couple of caveats. It says, unless you've got some kind of legal obligation, all right? Unless your functions or activities within your business legitimately need it. So you can sort of say, look, we reasonably might need access to this data again in the future. There needs to be, or the other reason you might have it is because of some sort of contractual obligation. And you might also decide not to immediately delete the data if you have the consent of the data subject, or if it's a child, obviously a legal guardian. So you can, POPI isn't an absolute. People often say to me, does POPI say I've got to delete my data? It's like, yes, essentially it is what it's saying. You've got to delete the data at some point. But you can justify keeping it for a set amount of time. That's the trick, though, is that you need to be able to say what is necessary. So I'm not keeping it any longer I'm not going to keep it any longer than is necessary. Well, what is necessary? And if you have one of those 4 reasons behind you, then you need to document that. And the way that retention records management has always done it is in a thing called a retention schedule. So you'll say things like, our HR records are such and such. We need to keep them for 5 years according to laws of South Africa or whatever country. All right, so that's what POPI has to say about retention and restriction of records in section 14. And how does that equate to our information lifecycle? So information lifecycle, or the data management lifecycle, the data lifecycle, I think we're quite familiar with it. You might have seen it as a document lifecycle or records lifecycle. It's all pretty much the same. So what we do is we at the point of collection, we look at our purpose specification and we say, why are we collecting this data? We then use it, and maybe for our initial purpose, and maybe we do further processing, which is when we realize actually we don't need to ask the data subject for more information. We can reuse that data for another reason, which isn't a million miles removed from what the data subject agreed to at the beginning. We need to store it, and obviously when we store it, we must think about security and continuity. We can share it, and we normally, under POPI, we would say that there's operators, right? So operators are given access. In other words, your hosting company. So if you're hosting your website with Xnilo data centers, then Xnilo is an operator. They are hosting the data for you. Or it might be more specific than that. Maybe you've got maybe you've outsourced your HR department, or you've outsourced your marketing department. Then those people have got access to the data there, and you're sharing it with them. We also then, at the end of the life cycle, obviously we need to either destroy or archive. And even with archiving, there's very few types of records that you legally have to keep forever. I think company records might be one, but there's very few, and ultimately you will destroy it. So the decision is, do we archive it now, or do we destroy it? And archiving means we pack it away so that it can't be touched, it can't be changed, it becomes a record. And this is why it kind of falls under records management, because it becomes a record of activity or a record of something that happened in the past, and it doesn't get changed anymore. So what we do is, in storage, for example, what we'll do is we'll take that out of sort of quite expensive high access storage, and we'll put that in a back-end storage somewhere with, you know, some sort of low access. So it might take a little bit of time to get to it, but it's available if anybody needs it. So an example of that would be, if you think about paper records, you might decide that, you know, you have a filing cabinet in your office and papers get stored in a filing cabinet because you're actively using it. However, there comes a point when you don't really need it actively anymore. So you might have to reference it again at year end, or maybe only if an auditor asks for it. So then what you'll do is that you'll pack away those papers into a box and send it off to someone like Document Warehouse or some similar warehousing or paper archival service. And obviously with electronic records, it's the same. You know, we pack it away, we secure it, and then if someone needs access to it, you unpack it and make it available again. The exceptions to destroying it, as I said, is if you need to keep it by law, if it's reasonably required, if there's consent to keep it, and if you have a contract. The trick is to make sure that you're very clear about what your justification is for not destroying the data. So you need to store some kind of metadata with it to say, you know, these were the decisions that were made, or have a retention policy or a retention schedule where you classify or categorize the type of record or the type of information, and then you assign a retention schedule to it. So in other words, we will delete it after 5 years. So if you send that box of papers away to Document Warehouse or someone like that, or Metrofile, they will ask you for what they call a file plan. And in the file plan, you'll say these are these types of documents that include all the records in here are these types of records. And then they'll say to you, when do you have to destroy this box by? And then you'll say 5 years or 1 year or 10 years or whatever it might be. And then at that time, they'll come back to your organization and say, it's 5 years down the line, it's 10 years down the line. This box was flagged to be destroyed now. Can we get approval to go ahead and destroy it? Now imagine you pack away a file right now, today, and in 10 years' time, someone is asked, is it okay to destroy this piece of paper? If you haven't adequately categorized or classified or described that document, that poor person in 10 years' time is going to have a very hard time. They're going to have to take that box back, open it up, read the whole thing, and decide and make a decision. So the filing and records management discipline is really important. But let's talk about, sorry,
Caroline, we've actually got 3 questions. I know Lesejo had her hand up. It's now down, but she put it up once or twice. I just want to check with her that she's okay, or if she still has a question.
Okay, thanks for that. I actually had 2 questions, but I see Patu asked one. So my question is, say for example, we have suppliers, right? Say for example, you're working for a bank and you have suppliers that you share sensitive information or personal data with, right? And when it comes to records management, I know that banks will have their own defined data retention schedule. And then you also find that the supplier, they also have their own defined data retention schedule, right? And we also have POPI that we need to take into consideration. So in most cases, you'll find that the 2 or the 3 schedules, they are not the same. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you then recommend? Do you penalize them? Like, which one do you take as a consideration?
All right. So look, POPI is not prescriptive. It says you can hold on to the records if the retention of the record is required or authorized by law, right? Sorry. So the bank obviously will have very clear ideas about what types of records it's got to have. Banks are highly regulated in the space. So there will be laws and regulations and maybe even sort of industry practices around how long you keep types of records. Those are usually captured in a records management policy or a retention policy. And then a schedule is created, and the schedule is for this type of record, we must delete it in 5 years. And the only reason we know that is because this law says we have to do it. POPI is asking you to be specific about that. Okay, so POPI is not overriding any of the existing practices or imposing anything new. What it's saying is you need to be clear. You need to write it down. Okay, you can't sort of just keep stuff in just randomly throw stuff into a file share or in a SharePoint directory or something, or a Dropbox, and just forget that it's there, in case you might need it one day. POPI is saying no, that's not allowed. You've got to go through those documents. You've got to understand why you're keeping them, and you need to know, has your original purpose ended? So we collected this information for a reason. Now we have to keep it for a reason. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so these things overlap. And in fact, POPI actually says at the beginning that it will POPI defers to any regulation that provides greater level of privacy protection. So if there's, say, for example, in the health industry, there are laws and regulations that provide, patient confidentiality. If that is providing a higher degree of privacy protection than what POPI is asking for, then those laws apply. All right, so it'll be the same in the banking industry. Now, just on your point about all these different parties having different retention schedules, it doesn't matter who's got the data, where you store it, or what format it's in, the retention schedule has got to be the same. All right, it was collected at source, it had a purpose, that purpose is ended, we now have a reason to keep it. we're going to keep it for a set amount of time, and then it's got to be destroyed. And in fact, the way you destroy it is important. That bit of information, that kind of like story about this record has got to travel with the record. And it doesn't matter what format it's in or how many versions, or, you know, if there's lots of copies of that record, all of them have got to be managed in the same way. Because one thing you don't want to be seen to be doing is willy-nilly deleting records. Like, oh, but POPI said we've got to delete the record. It's like, you know, there's a fine line between like looking like you're trying to just sort of get rid of information to hide things rather than actually following a set policy. So make sure that you are following a set policy, that it is a justified and justifiable process of deletion.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That. Yes,
all right.
It does.
Also, the bank is responsible for making sure that their suppliers treat the data in the same way that the bank would treat it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that we want. I wanted to add there, just to say that when you do have suppliers or people that may process your information, you need to have a clear arrangement and agreement with them that at times of exceeding retention schedules that record has, they have to ensure that it's deleted on their side and produce the appropriate evidence that has been disposed of or archived, whichever the retention schedule calls for. So that is almost a sharing agreement that you would have set up between the parties, and part of that is going to deal with this situation.
Yeah, and very often it has to be mentioned in the data processing agreement or your DPA. So every responsible party needs to have data processing agreements with any supplier or third party that processes personal information. Because remember, an operator is only a third party, is defined as a third party that processes personal information. All right. So first of all, you have to have a contract with them, and it's under GDPR and just general good practice is to have a data processing agreement. So it's a separate part of that contract that specifies really, really specifically what it is that you need that supplier to do and not do with the data.
And then,
what was the other question?
Oh, yes. And then what about physical records? Because I know in most cases we only focus on electronic record or electronic records. And also you'll find that in the policy, it only outlines the processes that need to be followed for electronic records. Because yes, companies, they can delete or destruct their electronic records, but how about, or what about physical records that they take to their offsite storage or facilities?
So the retention policy applies to the information, not to the way it is stored.
Yeah, yeah. And that it is important, Lesego, when you set up your policies to talk about both data in digital format and information that's in paper format. So any other format, it doesn't just have to be paper, it could be microfiche or audio records or whatever it is. So you have to
CCTV footage.
Yeah. So you have to deal with all of them.
Yeah, and in fact, in the medical industry, so for example, if you go for if there's going to be an operation in a theatre, so then the operating theatre gets checked before the operation, and the nurses do a whole bunch of tests to make sure that all of the equipment is calibrated and to make sure that everything is sanitary, right, and that everything is being cleaned properly. So they do things like litmus tests and stuff, which if you don't know is like a little piece of paper, and it's been treated with chemicals, and you touch it on surfaces, and if it changes color, then it means that it's contaminated. So they do that, and they actually keep those litmus tests, and they keep the little printouts from the medical equipment. You know, to illustrate that the calibration was correct. And all of that stuff gets put in a folder, and that is a file, that's a record.
Yeah.
And there are laws that say how long you've got to keep that record for.
And the other issue that comes about, especially I'm assuming with those litmus tests, is that media can deteriorate over time. So you now got to find ways of ensuring that you can reproduce it.
I'm glad you mentioned that. If you have got documents that need to stand the test of time, please, for goodness sakes, don't store them as a Word document or, you know, something that's going to, I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever tried to go back and open up a Windows 3 Word file. It's not really possible. You can't open them anymore. You struggle anyway. There is an international standard for archival. It's called PDF-A. So PDF documents are a standard for in other words, it's a standard way of storing information so that it can be opened by just about any, any reader could open it. But PDF-A is a standard for archive. Okay, so if you're serious about archiving, then store the documents, change the documents into PDF-As, make sure all the metadata is retained, and then destroy the Word document. Because you shouldn't be changing that Word document anymore anyway, because now it's a record. It's not a living document anymore. Okay.
So there's some other questions in terms of Marcel else asked, how would your function justify the retention period, and are there any guidelines? So, I think he's also concerned about just a sort of escape of, oh, we're going to keep it for so many years, and let's say 20 years, and that's not an appropriate for the purpose. So that's
So interestingly, I mean, this section here says the responsible party reasonably note. Okay, if you're a supplier or an operator, you have no reason to have that information if you don't have a contract anymore. Okay, so as soon as the contract ends, the data goes. But if you're a responsible party, if the responsible party reasonably requires the record for lawful purposes related to its functions or activities. So reasonably requires. So for example, and lawful meaning it's not excessive. You've taken all of the 8 conditions into account. You've taken into account other laws that apply. But when you reasonably require something, I'll give you an example. So let's say, for example, you are a bank or a financial company, but one of the things you do, for example, is that you might arrange events, or you might arrange training, right, for people. So I know that, for example, asset management companies, they have brokers that on-sell their services, and what they do is that they have to train these people to make sure that their skills are up to date. So they arrange training events that provide CPD points, or continual professional development points. And sometimes those people, so technically under POPI, once that event has ended and the person has got their certificate, they should really delete that person's information. However, it does happen that those people come back to that company and say, oh, I've lost my certificate. Do you have a record of the fact that I attended this training? And it's not like crazy that could happen 5 years after the training, right? It can happen. So because it could happen, they can make a call and say, look, it's not unreasonable, right, for people to come back and ask for the certificates after 5 years or 10 years. So we're just going to hold on to it for 10 years. That's what we're going to do. And the point is to write that down, right? So once you've made that decision, you've made the call, you understand it. Now, bear in mind that once you just make the decision to keep it, POPI applies. So you've got to make sure it's secure. You've got to make sure that the authorized access, you've got to have ownership. All of those things have to be in place for the lifetime of that document. Okay. And just in your question, I will be coming to a section just now about resources. I'll give you 3 good resources where you can have a look and see how you go about thinking about records management. Records management, by the way, is one of the oldest disciplines in the world. Yeah, I don't think I'm exaggerating here. I think the Romans had really good records management systems. It's really about, in fact, the monks, like way back in sort of the 1300s, had scrolls that they could find after 5 years. That's records management. But definitely in modern day, typing tools would create lots of documents they could put into filing systems, and you could find them. Okay, so and boxes would get destroyed. So people like Metrofile, a document warehouse, are actually experts in records management. Good.
Okay, so there's one more, and well, the 2 are related. So Batu asked, is depersonalization considered destroying or archiving of data? And Sammy continued this, and rightly so, to say that depersonalization is an ambiguous term similar to de-identification and pseudonymization. So different legislations, different people interpret them differently. So maybe if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that whole anonymization, depersonalization, it's a thing. Sometimes laws require you to redact records. So you'll see that documents get stored, but they have big black lines across some of the typing, right? So you can't with some of the content, or maybe over pictures. That's called redaction. So you're redacting the information to minimize how much information you're keeping. But in terms of anonymizing data, on paper records, maybe it's possible. It is contentious. It's a difficult thing. Yeah, and as we get more and more clever with data and combining data sets and big data and all that, we just, I don't know, I personally don't think there's really any such thing anymore. Yeah, ed tech industry has literally become geniuses at figuring out how to pinpoint a person. But yes, you're right. Technically, if the information does not pertain to an identifiable individual, it's not personal information, and POPI doesn't apply. But the other laws will.
And then Drew Kennedy is asking a question. He has a question about CCTV footage at POS or point of sale, or I mean, I suppose anywhere. Drew, is there a further question on that? You say you have a question. Would you like to share that?
You want to ask me directly?
Yeah, I think
so. Well, let me answer the question as I understand it. CCTV footage is a record. All right. Very often it is retained in order to stand up in a court of law. So it'll be one of your pieces of evidence you put forward in a court of law. So if any criminal activity did occur, or if there was a customer complaint, or somebody accused the organization of something, that there would be a record of what actually happened. So, for example, the CCTV at ATMs or at points of sale and things like that. The key thing there, though, is you have got to document the purpose, right? So what's the purpose of that footage? Then you've got to make sure that you understand the laws that pertain to that type of record. And if there aren't any, could be that there aren't any laws that particularly talk about that record, then POPI applies. Because CCTV footage will always be about people, right? So you'll always be able to identify people in the footage. So quite interestingly, for example, car dealerships, they will have CCTV footage in their warehouses or in their their showrooms. People can walk in to come and buy a car. Sometimes they walk in with another person, and sometimes that other person isn't their spouse. You know, you've got to be careful about that. That CCTV footage could be leaking information about people or about your customers or about, you know, so you've always got to treat CCTV footage as personal information, super confidential, keep it under strict security. And for goodness sakes, please secure the CCTV cameras. Okay, anything on the internet can be watched. It's possible to go onto Shodan, find CCTV cameras and control them and move them around and watch what people are doing in laboratories in California. So yeah, just please always secure any internet-enabled devices.
And then we've got one last question from Happy. Happy, you had your hand up. Question from you, sir.
Thanks, Howard. I just wanted to weigh in on the issue of de-identification. I think what's very important to add to the speakers is that when you want to rely on de-identification instead of completely destroying, should something go wrong, I think that's where everything starts. You know, if something goes wrong, that's where you start having a lot of issues, because you'll need to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that in your knowledge you have done anything to prove that according to the way you have de-identified, you cannot re-identify the data. You know, so that's where it becomes very tricky, because that time you need to show the test that you have conducted to show that in this manner that we have de-identified, we cannot re-identify the data. So that's very important note to when you want to use de-identification as your method, as an alternative to destruction. The other component that I wanted to touch on earlier on, Howard, was around the contract where you touched. Is very important. The retention and destruction requirements needs to be very clearly articulated in there, but that on its own, it starts attracting the regulations. because like now we're talking POPI, there are other regulations that will apply to certain sections of the organizations or specific organizations that might be prescriptive. Like in the banking sector, the FIC Act does go to those details, So I think it's very important that when we walk out of here, we must know that there might be alternative regulations that we need to take into consideration to determine that actual period, which can give us a leeway against POPI, which says distract us or keep as far as you need. Thanks.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's the point of a retention schedule. A schedule is basically, this is the schedule of records. So we basically say, right, within HR, we keep, the employment contract, your pension scheme selections, your, the fact that you've signed certain agreements, and all of those are records. And what you say is right, but for each one of these records, what law governs that record? And this is outside of POPI. This has got nothing to do with POPI. This is pure records management. What law governs this? What does that law say about how long we can allow to keep it for? And sometimes the laws actually have stipulations about how you've got to delete it or how you must destroy it. So that should be noted as well. All right, so it's just to kind of break down all the laws. And what POPI is doing is adding to that retention schedule. So it's saying, in the event that you don't have any legislation anywhere that's telling you what to do with the data, if it's personal information, POPI says you may not retain it for longer than is necessary, right? So you have to get rid of it at some point.
And then I think we got one last question from Marcel. Maybe not the last one. That's just Marcel, your hands up, sir.
Thanks, Howard. I don't want to belabor the point, but just on that point B, so a lot of people, what I was trying to say is a lot of people use legislation as a scapegoat to keep information forever. So typically at the regulators, statisticians and those type of people say, right, because I do this work, I look at the historical trends, I want to keep all my information forever to be able to do that. And that usually spikes data storage cost extensively. So, and that was what I was looking for. Is there a way that you can twist those type of scenarios into a retention schedule? Yeah. Because we do have that.
Yeah, okay. The keeping it forever argument. I had a client that tried that. They were desperate to not have to delete stuff, mostly because they had 20 to 30 years of stuff. That was really going to be a big exercise to figure out what needed to go. And they were trying every which way. And eventually they said, "No, Caroline, we don't believe you. We're going to go to get legal advice. We're going to go to the regulator. We're going to," they went and they asked everybody, and everybody came back and said, "You have got to destroy the data eventually." Right? It's like you can't, unless there is an absolute law that says, or an absolute reason why you've got to keep it forever, nothing stays forever. In my mind, a sensible blanket policy is to say anything older than 10 years should go. There's very few legislations. I mean, you might have one or two legislations that tell you to keep something for longer than that. But I can't see any reason, yeah, depending on your industry, but there's very seldom a really good reason to keep something longer than 10 years. And for goodness sakes, if it's things like, if you're arranging events and you're asking people for their dietary preferences, you really don't need that after the event is finished. Okay, I promise you, you don't need it. Okay, so yeah, just be careful. Don't go down that road. It's really difficult to defend that road.
Marcel, I also think that if you look at the case that you're mentioning, one would look at this, one would have the debate with them to say, you are looking at trends, and yes, you need that ongoing time series information, but does it require personal information? Can you aggregate it to an appropriate level with the justification that it can't be re-ID'd? But that's the important thing, is they certainly don't need, from a trend and an analysis point of view, in terms of what's the time series look like, There's no justification to keep the individual information.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks.
Caroline. Thanks.
I just want to at this point also just remind everybody, POPI applies to natural living people. So if someone is deceased, POPI doesn't apply. In addition, POPI applies to juristic persons. So company confidential information, information about organizations. Okay. So just bear that in mind. All right.
And just the last comment, I think Drew made a good comment, is it's all about documenting, justifying the reason and duration you are keeping the data for. So there were questions there, and that is the important one, and to have an appropriate discussion and debate around that. And I think it actually starts with data classification, and you can have different discussions at different levels.
Yeah, no, for sure. So the classification is the beginning point, and that's got to be applied consistently. What a lot of companies do is they put a retention policy at the bottom of their footers of the documents, so that they actually it's like stamped onto the document, whether it's printed or in digital format. At the bottom it says this document needs to be destroyed after 5 years or whatever.
Yes.
So let's move along just to talk about. We've covered a few of these now, so I'll just flick through this. Obviously, where we store information, file shares. Yeah, I once did a little exercise to have a look at a file share, and I calculated that if every document in that file share was if the first page of every document was printed, the stack of paper would have reached beyond the stratosphere. You know, if you take like how big a ream of paper is, how many reams of paper it actually represented, ridiculous amounts of information in file shares. You do need to start looking, you know, you need to have some sort of discovery tool or something to help you to find those documents and figure out who owns what and what can be deleted, what should be deleted. But again, if you can find everything that's 10 years old and older, get rid of it. Obviously, we store things on our hard drives or on our laptops. We store information on our cell phones, right? So if you've got Outlook on your phone and you're responding to messages, it's going to be storing information on your phone. We use external drives, things like that. We have paper stores. Email, a lot of people use their email inbox and sent items as a file store, like as a document library, or a record of activities. If that's what you're going to do, you need a retention policy for your email. Okay, so you need a retention schedule around what types of data are you storing in there and when are you going to get rid of it. Okay, terrifying to people, I know, because we want to keep every email. We also store it in the cloud in our data centers, hybrid cloud, storage, warehouses, anything in the cloud, and then of course cloud platforms. So just bear in mind that your retention policy has to apply to everything. Okay. To retain personal information lawfully, the first trick actually in all of this is section 10, which is minimize the data you collect, right? So categorize, classify the data, process it within, and so basically you need to have all the privacy dimensions, which is your why you collected it, who you collected it from, where you collected it, why you collected it, the purpose specification, the record of processing. All the elements of privacy should follow that piece of data, right? Another trick is to avoid rot, which is redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. If something has been stored, you need one copy of a record. You don't need 10 versions of the changes that happened along the way. The final record is the final record. Get rid of the other stuff. Okay, that's a very easy spring clean to do. Apply a retention policy, but do it consistently. Just don't go mad and just start deleting stuff. You need a policy and you need to follow the policy. You need to ensure the data is destroyed properly. There's e-waste, there's ways of deleting data, there's ways of destroying paper data, there's ways of destroying CCTV footage, there's ways of destroying hard drives. We need to make sure that we apply a good destruction policy, even like the way how we're going to destroy this information. All right. So, for example, I know Metrofile, for example, when they destroy data, they've got a clear data, I think it's called, service where they'll pick up your paper bins. They mulch it, so they pour water on it, they squish it down, they mulch it, and then they recycle the mulch. That's pretty definitely destroyed, right? Shredding on a normal shredder for sensitive information is not considered adequate. Okay, so just those normal line shredders. A diamond print shredder is okay, but really mulching off or burning are the only two real ways to destroy paper. And by the way, if a third party destroys data for you, if they delete data or destroy hardware or whatever, or like destroy paper, you need to get deletion certificates from them. Okay, they need to give you evidence, a record of evidence that they have destroyed, like what data did they destroy and how did they do it? Right, that's something a lot of people don't know. Yeah, you have to have some kind of evidence that this third party actually did what they said they were going to do. Another time that we destroy data.
Sorry, Carol, I think that's also applicable to ourselves. When we dispose of data, it's helpful to have that appropriate evidence so you can justify that it has been, so
it has been done. Yeah, a record of activity. So, this is something we did do. Yeah. And then another time we destroy data is when the data subject asks you to, right? There's data subject participation. When the data subject it decides that they don't want you to have the data, they're allowed to ask you to delete the data. Now, POPI has got very specific caveats around that, obviously. Like, for example, we can't delete it because we have a legal reason to keep it. So there are sort of a whole bunch of caveats, and that is a procedure that you should have in place in your organization to respond to data subject requests, right? So there's a whole procedure around it, verifying who the person is, making sure that you don't have a legal obligation to retain the data. And then obviously when it is a genuine request and you do need to destroy the data, you need to do it everywhere where you've got the data, right? Everywhere, not just on your core record system of record. It should be everywhere. Quite difficult to do if you've got bazillions of records. And just bear in mind that if you have a data breach, one data request, yeah, you can figure it out. You can muddle along and maybe spend 3 weeks trying to figure out where all the data is and delete it because you'd have no idea. If you have a data breach, you might actually get a couple of hundred requests. All right, in which case you're going to be setting up a department to go and find all the data. So just think about the cost. Okay. Righty, so where do you?
Sorry, Carol, there's a question from Happy or maybe a comment, Happy.
Thanks, Awad. I'm just cognizant of time. This is an interesting topic. I just wanted to add on the third parties, we must also think of the fourth and the fifth parties. Sometimes we fall into that trap where third parties are distracting at the subcontracting level, and there is a data breach you are running around. So all those kind of things, we need to make sure that they are watertight in the contract, that if distraction will be done at the fourth and the fifth party, we are all aware throughout that life cycle. Thanks.
For sure. Yes, because exactly right. The responsible party is responsible for that data through its entire supply chain, right? So all processes and sub-processes are the responsibility of the responsible party. And that is the type of thing that should be watertight in your data processing agreement. So anytime you hand data over to a third party, whether you are the responsible party or an operator, you need to make sure that your data processing agreement is watertight around things like how long are you allowed to keep this data. Okay, sorry,
Caroline. Sorry, I have a question that was raised when I was in Saudi Arabia, and they were asking about some of the challenges that they face with Visa and MasterCard. And up until 6 months ago, Visa and MasterCard were only expecting information about all of their transfers and the credit payments for global transfers, global payments. And then they started demanding all the information about local payments, which they're a little bit confused about. And they said, how do we enforce this level when we are using Visa and MasterCard? What is our responsibility in this situation when they demand that? I don't know whether there's an actual regulation, but they're basically saying that if you don't give us this information, you can't use our services.
Yeah, I've seen that happen with others, big organizations with some power. Yeah, that's another whole discussion. Sort of the responsible party and authority. It's a big deal. So yeah. So I think for now, what we're going to do is assume that you are the. So when we're looking at when you've got a big job like deleting gazillions of records that are going to reach the stratosphere if you had to print the first page of every document. Your first question is, am I processing this as a responsible party? That's your first question. Or am I processing this data as an operator? Because if you're processing as an operator, it's much simpler. If your contract with the responsible party is ended, the data must go. It's very simple. You either give it back to the responsible party or you just destroy it. If you're the responsible party, though, you need to categorize the type of processing and start with your riskiest risks, right? Because you've got your low, medium, and high processing, and it's kind of a factor of the type of processing we're doing as well as the types of personal information we're dealing with. So start with the stuff that is really risky personal information and stuff that is really risky processing. So people say to me, well, what is risky processing? What's the penalties, right? Where can you earn 10 million rand fine? In POPI, it's when you're not managing financial information well, right? Bank account details. All right, so that's where you start. If you're managing bank account details, start there. The next step, the next biggest fine is attached to transferring special personal information or information about children into other countries. So if you're doing that, that's risky processing. Go and look at that. And in fact, what you should have is in your privacy, your internal privacy policy. I'm not talking about your website privacy notice. I'm talking about your internal privacy policy, which is the same as your record retention policy. You need to have compliance checkpoints where things like restricted processing is understood and is bubbled up to be checked, right? So if you're doing things like direct marketing, automated decision-making, transferring personal information outside of South Africa, processing information about children, those are the things that you've got to make sure you've got retention policies for. If nothing else, okay, these things have got to have retention policies. All right, and then you can start working on the rest of the organization and the rest of the processing. All right, so prioritization according to penalty. Another way, another place where you can look at implementing retention policies, or you must look at is your best practice around IT management, right? So when we talk about asset management, if we talk about IT management, asset management is a place where we talk about disposable and retention. So just have a look at, across the different functions of your organization, how does each function facilitate this retention policy? Okay. And then when you talk about changes, new systems, new suppliers, projects, privacy by design and privacy by default are concepts where you build the privacy in from the beginning. So in the design phase, you build the concept into the design. So when you're planning your website, you say, we're going to add a form to our website to collect people's opinion about whether or not, about some topic. You need to, at that point, say, what is our obligation for keeping this information? Have we minimized it? Is this lawful processing? When are we going to delete it? Let's add it to the retention policy, the retention schedule. Does that make sense? So you've got to think about the retention schedule when you create the document. A nice place to do it is when you're creating a template for a type of document. So let's say you're creating a template for contracts. In the footer, make it clear what the retention policy is of the footer. So it's in the document. As soon as you create the document from that template, that record will then go forward with that retention policy assigned.
And maybe I could add a comment there, Caroline, because one of the things I noticed in your information lifecycle, where you start at collect, it can actually start earlier when you are planning and designing your forms. And so there's the collection, but there's the steps before that on plan and design that you can start describing your retention schedules and allowing people to review it and what the possible issues are. And so lots of times we forget about the front end of, now we just in what you're seeing here, you're just in collect mode, but we should have thought about this before.
Yeah, so apply your policies up front. Apply them here. Yeah, exactly. So guys, it's at 5 o'clock. I think this is just some resources, that you could look at. Actually, something I meant to add here was the SABS store. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the SABS store. I'll give you a little demonstration of it in a minute if you want to hang around after 5. But these are some of the places that I go to. The new one is this information regulator has provided us with procedures for making information electronically available. If you go onto their website and you look under PIO, which is Promotion of Access to Information, under the guidelines, there's a procedures tab. And in there's a procedure for making information electronically available. Sorry, why is that happening? So yeah, and it's a very good document. I highly recommend you download it. They've given a lot of good cross references to other resources and best practices and standards that are really solid. It's a very good document. I highly recommend you start there. And then also SACO, South Africa Institute for Chartered Accountants, I think. They have a guide on retention of records, which has for a long time been considered the go-to guideline for governance or for retention. And then the UK ICO, the UK always have really good guidelines, and their National Archives have a records management guide. And just something that you might not know, if you are an NGO or a non-profit organization, the National Archives actually have a mandate where they're supposed to help you with this. Okay, so just so that you know that they have a responsible duty actually to NGOs to help with records management. I stand to be corrected on that, but that's my understanding. And that is it from me. Howard, should we maybe continue with part 2 for next month?
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I just wanted to answer Bertie's question about blueprints and setting up policies and things like that. So yes, that certainly is the case. That was sort of what I was going to present on afterwards, but we can leave it for the next time. And really just focus on the management of your policies and having the policy management system that would link to all of the related policies and then notify you when the related policies may have changed or an update. You would need to review your policy. So having a system that correlates and cross-relates these different policies is important, but then also having an approach on how do you score your policies, how do you make sure that it's been refreshed and it's up to date. These are all important things that you need to look after. So yes, there are blueprints, and we do like to share that with you. But we'll take you through that in detail the next time we talk through. So if there are any more questions specifically on what Caroline has shared, happy to take them now. Otherwise, we'll start again next month this time and go more into the details of the policies and what you can do to manage that. Marcel, I see you got your hand up.
Just a quick one. I'm always getting confused what legislation trumps which one. If you can give some guidance on that, please.
Okay, so POPI says, if some other legislation provides a greater protection to the data subject, then that legislation prevails. All right. In other words, if there is legislation, for example, say governing the healthcare industry, that says you must delete data within 2 years, right? That is a better protection than POPI's requirement, which is delete it as soon as you don't need it anymore. Does that make sense? So POPI sort of has this catch-all of you must keep it, you must not have it anymore. Like you must get rid of it if you don't need it anymore, right? But maybe there's healthcare regulation on that particular record that says you've got to delete that. You've got no reason to keep it ever. Like as soon as the patient leaves the facility, you must get rid of that information. Or as within 2 years of the event, you must get rid of that information. So that law is more specific and provides greater protection for the person than POPI does.
Thanks, Caroline. That may understand the concept. Thanks for that.
Cool. You're welcome.
And Marcel, what you're finding now as well, especially in the government, they've got new laws called freedom of information, where people can request that certain government departments share detailed information about what they're collecting and what they're doing with the data. But then that one is interesting because that says that information can be provided unless there's a risk to national security or privacy, data privacy for subjects. So these things are being stretched now to all sorts of different areas in the production of data and people allowing to see what's going on.
So I'll just put those links up here into the chat for you. And then if you want to, I can show you what I was talking about with the SABS. I think it's one of these sort of secret resources that people don't utilize enough. So if anyone's interested, I can show you that. But otherwise, here's the links that I mentioned. If I can get into check. That was the first one. The second one. And here's the third one. Okay, you got those links.
Yes, the links are there.
All right, good.
So just
Okay.
maybe just a hands up, or anyone that would like to see the demo that Caroline has. Is anyone interested?
Otherwise, we can call it a day.
Yeah, we can actually do that next time as well. Just for everyone's notice, we don't share it individually. We don't share the recording individually. What we do is announce it on LinkedIn, and then you can request it. So only those that request it. So we try not to keep any of your information. And if you are interested, we'll post something on LinkedIn, and we'll notify people, and then you can request the link, the message from there and the recording. VJ, is that okay with you? Excellent. Guys, thank you very much. Happy, thank you for your contributions. Caroline, thanks again for your contributions. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad it was helpful. Yeah, and feel free to ping me with any questions in future.
Certainly.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and on Meetup. So.
Fantastic.
Good.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, guys.
Everybody.
Just bye.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Happy.
much. Bye.
Bye-bye.